A forest, a military base, strange lights, security patrols, an object reportedly seen at close range, unusual markings on the ground, radiation readings, a senior officer's memo, an audio recording made during the investigation, and more than 40 years of debate. Was Rendlesham Forest one of the most important military UFO encounters in history? Or was it a chain of misidentifications, confused memories, environmental effects, and Cold War anxiety? This is episode 3 of our 6-part mini-series from UFO Files to UAP Science. In episode 1, we followed the path from Project Blue Book to Arrow and asked how old UFO reports became modern UAP data. In episode 2, we revisited the 1952 Washington UFO wave and asked what modern radar, artificial intelligence, and sensor fusion would see today. Now, we move from the skies over Washington to the woods of Suffolk, England. December 1980, RAF Woodbridge, RAF Bentwaters, American military personnel stationed on British soil. A dark forest near sensitive military installations, and a case so famous it has been called the UK's Roswell. But today we're not simply retelling Rendlesham, we are asking a different question. If Rendlesham Forest happened today, how would modern UAP investigation handle it? What would base security systems record? What would thermal cameras see? What would satellite data show? What would environmental sensors reveal? What would AI do with the witness statements? How would investigators preserve the scene? How would chain of custody standards change the evidence? And most importantly, would modern sensor fusion make the case stronger, or would it explain it away? Welcome to UFO to UAP. I am your host, Matt Tones, and today we're investigating Rendlesham Forest Revisited, how modern sensor fusion would investigate the UK's Roswell. Let's begin. Rendlesham Forest occupies a unique place in UFO history. It is not a simple lights in the sky story. It is not a single witness report. It is not just folklore. It involved a sensitive Cold War environment. It generated official documentation. It produced witness testimony. It created physical location claims. It included a senior officer's investigation. It left behind audio and written records, and it has remained controversial for more than 4 decades. That combination is why Rendlesham matters, not because it proves aliens, not because every claim made about the case is equally strong, not because every later detail should be accepted without scrutiny, but because it is exactly the kind of historical UFO case that exposes the limits of old investigation methods. Something happened, people reported it, records were created, but the evidence was never captured in the full modern way we would expect today. And because of that, Rendlesham has lived in the space between mystery and argument ever since. That is the perfect case for this mini-series, because the whole purpose of From UFO Files to UAP Science is to ask, what happens when historical UFO cases are placed under modern investigative standards? Rendlesham forces us to ask that question. What would we know if the forest had been covered by modern surveillance? What would we know if every witness had a GPS time-stamped body camera? What would we know if ground disturbance was photographed, scanned, and sampled immediately? What would we know if radiation readings were logged digitally and compared against collaborated baseline data? What would we know if military radar, infrared, satellite, and environmental data were preserved and fused into one timeline? That is the heart of this episode, because Rendlesham is not only a UFO story, it is a lesson in evidence. The incident is generally described as unfolding over several nights in late December 1980 near RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters in Suffolk. At the time, these bases were used by the United States Air Force. They were part of the Cold War military landscape. That context matters because this was not a random forest. It was a forest beside military installations. And when strange lights or unknown objects are reported near military facilities, the question is not simply whether something looked unusual. The question becomes, did something enter or approach a sensitive security environment? Who saw it? How was it recorded? Was there a threat? Was there a breach? Was there a natural explanation? Was there a misidentification? Was there a classified activity? Was the evidence preserved? These are modern UAP questions, but in 1980, the investigative environment was very different. No smartphones, no automatic body cameras, no instantly synchronized sensor logs, no routine public satellite checks, no consumer GPS, no drone registries, no modern AI assisted pattern analysis, no cloud stored surveillance footage, no open source aviation tracking communities ready to analyze aircraft, satellites, meteors, weather, and military activity in real time. Instead, Rendlesham became a case built on witness reports, military memory, official memos, later testimony, audio records, and contested interpretation. That does not make it worthless, it makes it historically important and evidentially difficult. The strongest cases are not always the cleanest cases. Sometimes they are the cases that reveal what investigators failed to collect. Rendlesham is one of those cases. The story begins with reports of strange lights in the forest. Security personnel reportedly went to investigate. Some accounts describe a close encounter with an unusual object. Other accounts emphasize lights. Some witnesses later described a structured craft. Some details emerged over time. Some have been disputed, some have grown in the telling, and that is one of the first challenges. Historical UFO cases are not frozen in time, they evolve. A witness may report one thing at first, then years later, after interviews, documentaries, books, public debate, memory shifts, and new interpretations, the story can become more detailed, more dramatic, or more contested. That does not mean witnesses are lying. Human memory is complex, but it does mean investigators must separate early records from later claims. That is essential in the Rendlesham case. There is the original incident period, there are immediate or near immediate records, there is the Halt memo, there is the Halt tape, there are witness accounts, there are later interviews, there are later claims and interpretations, and a modern investigation would not treat all of these layers equally. It would ask, what was recorded closest to the event? Who wrote it? When? For what purpose? What did each witness say at the time? What details appeared later? Which claims are corroborated? Which are disputed? Which are unsupported? Which are central? Which are peripheral? This is not skepticism for the sake of dismissal. This is how real investigation works. Because the more famous a case becomes, the more important it is to protect the evidence from the mythology that grows around it. Question for you. When you hear a famous UFO case with decades of later testimony, do you trust the earliest official records more or the later witness accounts that include more detail? Add your answer in the comments because Rendlesham forces us to decide what kind of evidence carries the most weight. Now, let's look at why Rendlesham became known as the UK's Roswell. That nickname is powerful, but it can also be misleading. Roswell is associated with a crash narrative, a changing official explanation, recovered material claims, and decades of cover up allegations. Rendlesham is different. It is a military base adjacent encounter involving lights, reported ground traces, witness testimony, and official documentation. The cases are not the same, but the nickname tells us something about cultural meaning. Like Roswell, Rendlesham became bigger than the event itself. It became a symbol of hidden truth, a symbol of military secrecy, a symbol of government ambiguity, a symbol of witnesses claiming more happened than officials publicly acknowledged. And like Roswell, it sits at the intersection of evidence and legend. That is why it remains so compelling. But if we want to understand it seriously, we need to move beyond the nickname. We need to look at the evidence categories. There are four major evidence categories in Rendlesham. First, witness testimony. Second, official documentation. Third, audio recording. Fourth, physical site claims, including reported ground marks and radiation readings. Each category matters, each has strengths, each has weaknesses, and each would be handled differently today. Let's start with the witness testimony. The witnesses are central to Rendlesham. Military personnel reported unusual events near a sensitive base area. That gives the testimony weight. These are not casual tourists stumbling through the woods. There were people operating in a security context. They had responsibilities. They were trained to notice unusual activity near military property. That matters. But military witnesses are still human witnesses. They can misperceive. They can be affected by darkness, stress, weather, expectation, distance, fatigue, group dynamics, the unfamiliarity of the environment, and the pressure of an unusual event. A modern investigation would respect the witnesses, but it would not rely on memory alone. It would capture witness statements immediately, separately, before they discuss details with one another. It would record exact timelines, exact locations, direction of observation, duration, estimated distance, elevation angle, weather conditions, emotional state, lighting conditions, sound, smell, movement, and whether the witness had any optical aids. It would also compare statements for consistency. Where do they match? Where do they differ? What details are shared independently? Which details appear only after group discussion? Which details appear years later? This is how modern witnesses analyze works. The goal is not to discredit people, the goal is to understand what they actually observed. Because witness testimony is valuable, but it becomes far more valuable when preserved correctly. In Rendlesham, we do not have the level of immediate, synchronized witness documentation we would want today. That is one reason the case remains debated. Now, let's move to official documentation. The Halt Memo is one of the reasons Rendlesham has remained important. A senior officer wrote a memo describing unexplained lights and related details. Official documentation gives a case institutional weight. It means the event was not simply a rumor, it entered the record. But documentation also has limits. A memo is not raw evidence, it is a written summary. It reflects what the author understood, chose to include, and had available at the time. It may be accurate, it may be incomplete, it may omit context. It may use cautious language. It may be written for a specific bureaucratic purpose. A modern investigation would not stop at the memo. It would ask what evidence supports the memo. Where are the logs? Where are the radio transmissions? Where are the patrol records? Where are the base security reports? Where are the radar records? Where are the photographs? Where are the environmental readings? Where are the original witness statements? Where is the complete chain of custody? That is the difference between a historical file and a modern data package. A file tells us an event was recorded. A data package lets us test what happened. Rendlesham has files. What it lacks by modern standards is a complete data package, and that is the central problem. Now let's talk about the Halt tape. The audio recording is one of the most fascinating parts of the case because it captures a real-time or near real-time investigative moment. This matters because audio can preserve tone, sequence, urgency, and observation in a way later testimony cannot. You can hear people reacting. You can hear them describe what they believe they are seeing. You can hear the process unfold. That makes the tape valuable. But again, audio is not complete evidence. It captures voices. It does not show what they saw. It does not independently confirm distance. It does not establish object size. It does not provide sensor correlation. It does not prove origin. A modern investigation would treat the audio as one evidence layer. Important, but not decisive alone. It would align the audio with a timeline. It would match comments to exact location. It would synchronize the GPS points. It would compare the night sky conditions. It would check aircraft activity. It would check satellite passes. It would check lighthouse visibility. It would check weather. It would check whether the described movements match known celestial or terrestrial sources. It would ask what were they seeing at each moment. What was the line of sight? What was the bearing? What was the elevation? What else was visible from that position? This is the kind of reconstruction that modern tools make possible. And this brings us to one of the most debated conventional explanations, the Orford Ness Lighthouse. For years, skeptics have argued that some of the lights reported during Rendlesham may have been misidentified light from the Orford Ness Lighthouse or other ordinary lights in the area. This explanation is controversial. Some witnesses strongly reject it. Supporters argue it fits aspects of the sightings and flashing lights. Critics argue it cannot explain the full case, especially the close-range object accounts and ground trace claims. This is exactly where modern investigation would be useful. It would not simply ask, could it have been the lighthouse? It would model the geometry. Where was each witness standing? At what time? What was the visibility? What was the line of sight? Was the lighthouse visible through the trees? What was its flashing pattern? How bright would it appear? Would it align with the direction reported? Would movement through the forest create an illusion of motion? Would atmospheric conditions affect appearance? Would other lights be visible in the same direction? A modern investigation would use mapping, laser range finding, elevation models, optical simulation, and time synchronized reconstruction. It would test the explanation, not mock it, not accept it blindly, test it. That is the difference between debate and investigation. Question for you. Do you think conventional explanations like the Orford Ness Lighthouse should be treated as serious possibilities in Rendlesham, or do you think they fail to explain the full case? Drop your answer in the comments because this is one of the biggest divides in the Rendlesham debate. Now let's turn to the physical site claims. Reports from Rendlesham include claims of marks on the ground and unusual readings taken in the area. These are some of the most compelling elements for people who believe something physical interacted with the forest environment. But they are also some of the hardest to evaluate decades later, because physical evidence depends on procedure. Who found the marks? When? Were they photographed? Were they measured? Were they protected from contamination? Were soil samples taken? Were tree samples taken? Was the area secured? Were radiation readings taken with collaborated equipment? Were baseline readings taken in surrounding areas? Were readings repeated? Were results documented in a way that can be independently reviewed? Were alternative causes examined? This is where modern chain of custody standards become critical. If an event like Rendlesham happened today, investigators would need to secure the scene, mark the parameter, photograph everything, use 3D scanning, record GPS coordinates, collect soil and vegetation samples, document footprints, document equipment used, log every person entering the area, take baseline environmental measurements, repeat radiation readings, check calibration records, preserve samples for independent analysis. That is how physical site evidence becomes useful. Without that, the evidence remains interesting but contested. A mark in the ground may be meaningful, or it may have an ordinary explanation. A radiation reading may be useful, or it may reflect normal background variation, instrument issues, improper procedure, or environmental factors. This is not dismissal, this is the standard required if physical evidence is going to carry serious weight. Rendlesham is important partly because it shows why that standard matters. Once the scene is not preserved properly, uncertainty becomes permanent. That is the lesson. Not that the witnesses were wrong, not that nothing happened, but that the evidence was not captured in a way that can close the argument. Modern UAP investigation must do better. Now let's imagine Rendlesham happening today. Security personnel report strange lights near a base. The first layer would be immediate location tracking. Every patrol member would likely carry a phone, radio, GPS device, or body-worn technology. Their positions could be logged. Their movement through the forest could be reconstructed. Timestamps would be automatic. If they recorded video, metadata would establish time and location. If they communicated over radio, transmissions could be preserved and synchronized. The second layer would be base security. Modern installations may have cameras, thermal systems, motion sensors, perimeter alarms, infrared imaging, and access logs. Investigators would ask, did any parameter system detect movement? Did camera capture light? Did thermal sensors see a heat signature? Were there power fluctuations? Were alarms triggered? Were aircraft operating nearby? Were drones detected? Were any security systems offline? The third layer would be airspace data. Civilian and military radar would be checked. Known aircraft would be identified. Flight paths would be reviewed. Transponder data would be compared. Helicopters, training flights, and low altitude traffic would be examined. If there was a drone, detection systems might show it. If there was a meteor, astronomical databases might confirm it. If there was a satellite pass, orbital data might explain it. If there was a re-entry event, space tracking would matter. The fourth layer would be environmental data, weather, visibility, cloud cover, wind, temperature, atmospheric conditions, moon phase, light pollution, nearby light sources, lighthouse visibility, all of it would be included. The fifth layer would be witness capture, immediate interviews, separate statements, exact line of sight drawings, confidence levels, perception conditions, stress factors. The sixth layer would be AI assisted analysis. AI could compare witness descriptions against known light patterns. It could analyze video frames. It could detect inconsistencies in timelines. It could correlate sensor logs. It could compare the event to historical patterns. It could flag anomalies, but AI would not replace human judgment. It would assist investigators, that is sensor fusion. Not one piece of evidence, many pieces combined. And this is why Rendlesham is so valuable as a modern case study, because every part of it asks for a sensor layer that did not exist or was not preserved in 1980. Strange lights? We need optical, thermal, radar, and positional data. Close encounter claims? We need body cameras, GPS, and scene mapping. Ground tracers? We need forensic collection, radiation readings. We need calibrated baseline comparison. Audio recordings? We need synchronization with location and visual data. Witness testimony? We need immediate structured interviews, official memos. We need supporting raw evidence. That is what modern UAP science demands, and without it, the case remains trapped, compelling, but unresolved. Question for you. If Rendlesham happened today, which evidence would matter most to you? Body camera footage, radar data, thermal imaging, soil samples, radiation readings, or witness testimony? Tell me in the comments because the answer reveals what kind of proof people are really looking for. Now, let's explore the role of Cold War context. Rendlesham happened during a tense period. Military bases in Europe were part of a strategic environment. The United States, NATO, and the Soviet Union were locked in a global confrontation. That matters because unknown events near military installations were not just curiosities. They could represent espionage, intrusion, testing, psychological operations, misidentified military activity, or genuine unknowns. A modern investigator would examine this context carefully. Was there any classified training activity? Were foreign aircraft being monitored? Were there exercises in the area? Were local security tensions elevated? Were there known incursions? Were surveillance systems being tested? Were personnel primed to be alert? Context does not explain the case by itself, but context shapes perception and response. If security personnel are already operating in a sensitive environment, they may respond more intensely to ambiguous stimuli. That is not a criticism, it is part of the environment. In UAP investigation, context is evidence. Where something happens matters. When it happens matters. Who sees it matters. What else is happening nearby matters. This is one reason Rendlesham remains important. It occurred in a military context where unknown activity would matter even if it turned out to be ordinary. because ordinary explanations can still expose security vulnerabilities. If the incident was caused by misidentified lights, that still raises a question. Why did trained security personnel interpret them as potentially serious? If it was a foreign or classified system, that raises another question. How did it enter or approach sensitive areas? If it was a genuine unknown, the question becomes even more serious. Every scenario teaches something. That is why UAP research should not be obsessed only with exotic answers. Even conventional explanations can reveal failures in training, reporting, sensor coverage, communication, or public transparency. Rendlesham is a case where the process matters almost as much as the object. What did personnel do? How was the event reported? What did commanders know? What did the Ministry of Defense receive? What was preserved? What was ignored? What was later disputed? These are process questions, and process questions are central to modern disclosure. Now, let's talk about the Ministry of Defence response. The UK Ministry of Defence has historically stated that the Rendlesham events pose no threat to national security. That is an important phrase, no threat to national security. Governments often evaluate UFO or UAP cases through that lens. Not was it mysterious, not was it extraordinary, not will the public find it compelling, but did it pose a defence threat? That difference is crucial. A case can remain unexplained and still be judged non threatening. A case can be strange but not actionable. A case can fascinate the public but not trigger further government investigation if it does not appear to threaten defense interests. This is one of the biggest gaps between public interest and official interest. The public asks, what was it? The defense system asks, was it a threat? Those are related questions but not identical. This gap existed in Blue Book, it existed in the Washington Wave, it existed in Rendlesham, it exists today with Arrow. If the government says a case is not a threat, the public often hears. They are dismissing it, but the government may mean we do not have evidence it endangered national security. That does not necessarily answer what it was. This is why official language can frustrate the public. A statement can be technically accurate but emotionally unsatisfying. No threat does not equal no mystery. No evidence of extraterrestrial origin does not equal fully explained. Unidentified does not equal alien. Insufficient data does not equal nothing happened. These distinctions matter. Rendlesham sits right in the middle of them, and that is why it remains controversial. Now, let's address later claims. Over the years, Rendlesham has accumulated additional layers. Some witnesses have made more detailed claims. Some accounts include physical contact with a craft. Some include symbols. Some include binary code narratives. Some include claims of missing time or deeper government knowledge. These later claims are part of the Rendlesham story as a cultural phenomenon, but a careful investigation must separate them from the core evidence. That does not mean we automatically reject them. It means we classify them properly. Original record, near-time testimony, later testimony, speculative interpretation, media development. Each layer must be labeled. That is exactly what modern UAP research needs to do more often. Not all evidence is equal. A memo written close to the event is not the same as a memory described decades later. A real-time audio tape is not the same as a documentary reconstruction. A witness statement is not the same as a sensor record. A ground mark is not the same as a calibrated forensic result. A hypothesis is not a conclusion. If we want serious disclosure, we need evidence discipline. Rendlesham is a perfect example of why. The case is important enough to study, but complex enough to require careful sorting. Now let's imagine a modern report on Rendlesham written by a future Arrow-style office. It might divide the event into categories: visual sightings, security patrol reports, physical site observations, environmental data, known light sources, aircraft activity, radar correlation, witness testimony, audio evidence, possible explanations, confidence levels. It might say some observations are consistent with known terrestrial sources, some claims lack sufficient data, Some witness accounts remain unexplained. Some physical evidence cannot be verified due to insufficient chain of custody. Some later claims cannot be corroborated by the original record. That kind of report would probably frustrate everyone. Believers would say it avoids the mystery. Skeptics would say it gives too much weight to weak testimony, but it would be more honest than forcing one clean answer. Because Rendlesham may not be one event. It may be a cluster, multiple nights, multiple observations, multiple witnesses, multiple interpretations, some ordinary, some unresolved, some perhaps exaggerated, some perhaps misunderstood, some perhaps genuinely anomalous. Modern UAP science must be able to handle clusters, not just single events. This is another reason sensor fusion matters. Sensor fusion does not only combine technical data, it helps separate mixed events. A UFO wave may contain satellites, aircraft, stars, radar artifacts, weather effects, drones, and unknown all at once. A forest incident may contain lighthouse lights, military activity, witness confusion, physical traces, and one or more unexplained observations. The goal is not to preserve the legend, the goal is to separate the signal from the noise. That phrase matters. Signal from noise. The history of UFOs is full of noise. Some of it is cultural, some of it is bureaucratic, some of it is human, some of it is technical, some of it is secrecy, some of it is storytelling. The job of modern UAP science is to find the signal, if one exists. That is what Rendlesham teaches us. Now there is one more major lesson: stigma. In 1980, reporting a UFO incident could damage reputations. Even military personnel could face ridicule. That stigma affects evidence. People may delay reporting. They may downplay details. They may avoid official channels. They may speak informally instead of formally. They may not preserve evidence because they do not expect the case to be taken seriously. They may feel pressure to accept conventional explanations, or they may later become more forceful because they felt dismissed. Stigma distorts the record. That is why modern UAP reporting systems are important. A good system does not require a witness to believe in anything. It simply allows them to report anomalous observations without ridicule. That is essential, because if people do not report, data is lost. If data is lost, cases remain unresolved. If cases remain unresolved, public suspicion grows. That cycle has defined the UFO subject for decades. Rendlesham sits inside that cycle. Military witnesses report something. Official systems respond in limited ways. The case becomes public. The public doubts the official conclusion. Witnesses continue speaking. The story grows. Debate becomes permanent. Modern UAP science should break that cycle, not by proving every claim, by capturing better data early. That is the key. Early data matters. The first hours matter. The first statements matter. The first photographs matter. The first sensor logs matter. The first environmental readings matter. The first chain of custody decisions matter. If those are weak, the case may never recover. Rendlesham may never be fully resolved because those early evidentiary foundations were not built in the way modern investigators would demand. That is not a failure of the witness alone, it is a failure of the system around the unknown. And that is the theme of this entire miniseries. Historical UFO cases do not just lack answers, they often lack systems capable of producing answers. That is why we move from UFO Files to UAP Science, because files preserve uncertainty. Science tries to reduce it. As we close episode 3, let's return to the forest. Imagine standing there in 1980, December. Dark trees, cold air, a military base nearby. Personnel trying to understand strange lights, a senior officer recording observations, measurements being taken, a story beginning before anyone knows how big it will become. Now imagine the same event today. Body cameras recording, GPS tracking every movement, thermal sensors scanning the woods, base cameras capturing the perimeter, radar data being preserved, satellite passes being checked, AI reconstructing the timeline, radiation readings logged digitally, soil samples sealed and analyzed, witnesses interviewed separately within hours, a public report eventually explaining what was known, what was ruled out, and what remained unresolved. That is the difference, not certainty, process. Modern science may not solve every mystery, but it should prevent future mysteries from becoming permanently trapped in weak evidence. That is why Rendlesham matters. It is not only a famous case, it is a warning. If we do not preserve the evidence properly, the unknown becomes legend. And once it becomes legend, it becomes almost impossible to separate what happened from what people believe happened. Final question for you. Do you think Rendlesham Forest would still be considered mysterious if it happened today under modern sensor fusion and forensic standards? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to hear where you stand. This has been UFO to UAP. I am Matt Tones. This is episode 3 of our mini-series from UFO Files to UAP Science. In episode 4, we move into the modern era with the case that changed everything, the Nimitz Tic Tac encounter. But we're going to approach it through the lens of this series. Not simply what happened, but why the Tic Tac became the bridge between old UFO testimony and modern sensor-led UAP investigation. If you found this episode valuable, follow the show, share it with someone interested in Rendlesham Forest, UFO disclosure, UAP science, Arrow, military encounters, sensor fusion, declassified files, and the future of the unexplained. And remember, Rendlesham Forest may never give us a perfect answer, but it gives us something just as important. A blueprint for how future UAP cases must be investigated before the evidence disappears into history.